Welcome to Smart Money Simplified with Brent Mekosh from the Wealth Stewards. In this podcast, Brent discusses some of the most important and interesting topics of the day as they relate to finance, the economy, and beyond. Now, on to the show.
And welcome to the Smart Money Simplified podcast with your host, Brent Mekosh. Brent, it is always good to be with you. I do have to say I'm excited about this particular edition of the podcast, though.
This is really good, and I think it's going to be very timely. And I'm going to open this discussion with a story of my background. So my family now for probably about 60 years has had a camp up in central Ontario. For Canadians that might listen to this, we're talking north and west of Sudbury and south and west of Timmins. And during the summer times that we would spend up there, there's some kids at the end of the lake, some Canadian kids. And if I really wanted to piss them off and razz them, I would say that they were America's top hat or a 51st state or something like that. Sometimes it would turn into a wrestling match. So, occasionally, tempers would definitely flare. My Canadian friends for sure did not like that. Never did I think I'd be in a situation where we've got a president of the United States that's basically saying the same thing. But along with that, I think more significantly is anyone that's following the news cycle, anyone's watching the financial markets, we've had a ton of volatility over the last couple of weeks. We're recording this on Tuesday, March 11th. We expect this thing to come out in about 2 weeks. But we've had a ton of volatility. And you're looking at Canada. This is our biggest trading partner. I was speaking with a client of mine just the other day, has a manufacturing business. They've got some parts coming in from Canada we don't know day to day what these tariffs are going to be, but he's like, do I pass this on to my customers? Do I try to find, change my supply chain, look for new suppliers and everything else. So I have got Kim Moody on, and Kim is one of the foremost tax experts in all of Canada. I mean, he's written a ton of pieces up there. He knows pretty much all the politicians and all the key players up there on a first name basis. And Kim, I am really, really happy to have you with me today. So you're up in Alberta. Give me a taste of what's going on up there with everything that we have in the news the last few weeks.
Thanks, Brett, for having me on. Thanks, Bill, for facilitating. And it's an interesting time here in Canada right now. I mean, first of all, we kicked the shit out of your hockey team here recently. So
that did happen. Touche.
Easy. Okay,
that's the truth, though, Bill. You got to call it like you see.
Yeah, but we got them first. Okay, I mean, we got them first. So
well, it's always a fun time, and of course, Canada just dominates. Hockey, and that's certainly nationally one of our passions. But in terms of news cycles and economics, and there's not a day that goes by or an hour or a minute that goes by without some sort of news from your illustrious president. And I think there's a lot of us in Canada, certainly in the conservative bent, and I'm very much a conservative leaning fiscalist and socialist, social leaning conservative, that looked at the two choices that your country had in terms of presidential choices, and I thought, well, hold our nose. If I was in your shoes, I'd be probably holding my nose and voting for Trump. But that's kind of backfired a little bit because of the attacks on our country economically with tariff impositions, and so there's a lot of emotional responses with respect to what's happening. Not a lot of logical responses, but a lot of certainly emotional responses. As a matter of fact, the piece that I published in the Financial Post this morning, I talk about that. I talk about the chaos theory of leadership that Donald Trump clearly is deploying parts of, and let's create a whole bunch of chaos and see what comes out of that, so I can be in a better bargaining position. I mean, anybody that studies leadership 101 can clearly see that that's his style. Although he deploys a whole bunch of other stuff randomly as well, but for the rational person, you can see that. For the mostly irrational people, because I would say generally people are not very rational, it triggers irrational emotional responses, and you're seeing a lot of that in Canada right now. I hate Trump, booing the American national anthem at every chance they get, and it's actually, from that perspective, quite embarrassing. We're also seeing a lot of virtue signalers, Team Canada, when it comes to a trade approach, and it's buy Canadian, which hell, I mean, I'll buy Canadian any day of the week I can, but so the fact that he's attacking, us with tariffs doesn't make that any different. So it goes on and on, Brent, but we're seeing a lot of emotional responses, not so much, rational responses at the moment.
Now, Canada, most of my experience in your country has been now I'm out in the west, west of the United States, down in Arizona. Get up to Vancouver frequently. Amazing, beautiful city. BC is a beautiful province. Obviously, I've got family history in Ontario. Both of those areas of your country tend to be more like our coastal liberal areas that we have here in the United States. Now, you're up in Alberta, which is kind of the heart of the conservative movement up there. I'm curious when you mentioned that our choices were Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, and the country chose Donald Trump. Why was that the better choice from your perspective as a Canadian? Also, noting that you're from Alberta, which generally speaking would be more red if if such a label exists for Canada.
Well, believe me, there's a lot of people that disagree with me, but it, the choice, when you look at just, the more business friendly, the more economic friendly president, it was quite clear that it was Donald Trump, pro-business. And pro-business has a lot of spillout effect that progressive liberals just don't see. And so, I love this whole concept that has been invented, I don't know when, but trickle down economics is proven not to work. How about shut the F up? Because that just makes no sense whatsoever. When you have an entrepreneur that risks their capital and then ultimately starts hiring people and creates jobs, that's just classic trickle down. I hate that phrase, but that's that spins benefits widely. And so I think ultimately that's the reason why a person like me, I'll speak for myself, looked at Kamala Harris with her radical left ideologies, spend, 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 and it just made no sense for the person that ultimately is pro-business. And so that's, I think, the reason why, Brent.
Now, so let's go back to the tariffs now. So what is this? What do you think the end result of this is going to be? Because my take on it is, you're our largest trading partner. Anybody that's been over the bridge between Detroit and London, Ontario, it's just constant trucks going back and forth, and that's just one of many border crossings. We're two economies that, not just through NAFTA, but in a ton of ways historically, are deeply, deeply intertwined. And so if you're going to upset that apple cart, I mean, there's going to be carry-on effects. I think with Trump, my position on him is that he's kind of put himself in this point in, at least in his own mind, where he's not going to lose, because I do think he's a fan of tariffs. He's made no secret about that. He thinks that it's a great way for the government to both do a couple things: increase revenues, but also potentially bring back some of these industries that have long ago left U.S. shores. So my question to you is, how real, from a Canadian's perspective, do you think that these tariffs, like, what's the sticking power of them, or is it just rhetoric? Is it just something that's a negotiating tool? And if all of a sudden we've got 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, or is it 50% now? I don't know. They're changing it day to day, and some days it's gone. What are the long-term repercussions of those tariffs in two ways? First, what the actual financial impact will be between our two countries. But secondly, businesses and markets don't like uncertainty. They want to be able to get some measure of what their costs are going to be in future years. And you throw these wild numbers out there that are really big, that can impact what companies' bottom lines are. How do you, you're a tax guy. How do you make this all make sense?
Well, with a leader like Trump, it's hard to make sense of some of his actions. The typical, the chaos theory of leadership basically is what I already said. And I liken it to taking a stick to a hornet's nest, stirring it around and then ultimately seeing what happens. And then trying to get some patterns out of that, and then, rebuild whatever is destroyed in whatever way you want. I have to think that that's ultimately part of what Trump is doing here, is trying to disrupt status quo, and so that ultimately he gets a better deal, for his country, your country. Where do I think this is going to head? Good question, but I have to think that tariffs are not a long-term solution to much. I think they're destructive to both imposer of tariffs and the recipient of tariffs, and ultimately it's the end consumer that either directly or indirectly is the loser. So I don't see tariffs as being a long-term winner strategy. I think in the short term, yeah, I think it's a great negotiating tactic. And that's kind of where my head is in terms of a logical response, is that I think this is a way to get a better trade deal. rip up the existing, free trade agreement that we have in our countries. This whole thing of fentanyl, frankly, is just a legal way to try and not follow the existing trade agreement. Sure, fentanyl is a big issue and has disrupted a lot of families, but to suggest that that is the big reason why we need change, I don't think so. I think so it's just a technical legal out to the existing agreement so as to impose measures that the existing agreement allows for if if there's so-called national emergency powers or whatever the proper legal language is in the agreement to allow for this. So I think succinctly, I think where this is heading is some sort of renegotiated trade deal. I don't see it having staying power. In terms of your damage question, there's no question that economic damage will be inflicted on Canada. There will certainly be on your country as well in certain pockets. But the United States is such a behemoth that they can withstand way more than we can withstand. We're a small country, 40 million people, roughly 41 million people. And any economic shock is going to hurt us greatly. And so I worry about the short-term effects of tariffs. And where this is heading, I think, is a longer-term strategy of whatever government we get, trying to de-link our economies from the United States as much as it is today. I mean, right now we're tied to we're tied together greatly. But if we could sell our oil, sell our natural gas, which are huge industries in Canada, if we could sell that to other markets, then great. The most logical is Europe. I don't think there's a big appetite for China. But if we could sell our natural gas to Germany, some of the other more friendly European states, then I think that's probably where we're heading. And getting rid of any provincial barriers that we have in Canada. I don't know if in the States, if you guys had the same thing, but there's a lot of interprovincial barriers on trade. As a common example, if I want to buy Ontario wine, which by the way is shitty wine, but if I did want to buy it,
Ice wine, their ice wine's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's okay. But to get a nice bottle of wine out of Ontario is like saying you're going to get what? Great oil out of somewhere, somewhere that doesn't produce oil. So, using a bad example, but we have a ton of those kind of trade barriers across Canada, and the sooner those can come down, the better, so that we can ultimately, distribute our products across the country and at each ends of the ocean. So I think that's kind of where we're heading. It's I don't know, long-winded answer, but hopefully I've addressed some of your questions there, Brent.
No, absolutely not. And I want to circle back and talk about how the national view, particularly on exploiting Canada's energy, might change because of this. But first, I want to touch on this idea of what is Canada's opinion of NAFTA and the existing trade regime. Because here in the United States, I think I'm in a luxury business. I'm working with people that have accumulated a certain degree of wealth. I spent a lot of time in New York City. We're out here in the West Coast, but where I really have some heart and some empathy is if you go through the Midwest, if you go through areas that were historically manufacturing hubs in the United States, these places are burned out. And I think if you're a person, this is not for or against Trump for listeners out there, but if you're a guy whose dad worked in the mill that is now just a rusting heap in a ruin, and you're working at the Walmart or something like that, you're angry, you're pissed off because you feel like the political power is in charge and the financial power is in charge in order to add 1% to GDP or to boost your stockholders, gutted your town, and they sent all that manufacturing capability overseas. And these men and women are looking around saying, what the hell do we do? And so, depending on where you are in the United States, NAFTA was viewed as a horrible deal for the U.S., like a tragically horrible deal for the industrial centers of this country. Does Canada have that same opinion of NAFTA, or is it a more favorable spin on it?
I'd say it's a more favorable spin. I mean, certainly there's pockets of people. I read one person online today. I looked at this guy's history, and not the most intelligent guy in the world, but from what I can tell, when the first free trade agreement came in, I think in 1988, if I recall, under Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan, I think it was at the time, It was considered a landmark deal, and there was a lot of pros and a lot of cons. Like, it was kind of split, and it became an election issue in Canada, and ultimately, Prime Minister Mulroney won the day on that. And I think over time, it's proven that, yeah, this is beneficial to Canada, to try to have increased trade. And so I don't see, the split like it was when it was first imposed in 1988. I think it's softened lots over time. This fellow I read this morning was saying, well, we warned you 30 years ago that this was going to be a disaster, and look what's come out. People like that I just have no time or respect for. But to your point, I don't think, given your example of the Midwest towns, is all that parallel Canada.
Got it. Now, going back to your domestic politics there, you've had a leadership in place at the national level that has not been friendly towards Canadian energy. And, my experience in Ontario versus I've been up to Edmonton, been to Calgary, been in your neck of the woods a couple times. And, you're at the epicenter of the oil sands up here. And it's a very different opinion of Canadian energy and how to exploit it. Do you think that now, with everything you mentioned, this idea of Canada, looking internally to Canada, what your strengths are and looking at the resources that you have, do you think this might have, for Canada, as a person that quite frankly is a huge proponent of I think countries survive and they thrive and they dominate based on energy. They base intellectual capital and energy. They need both. And you've been kind of held back as a nation in exploiting your resources. Do you think now that mood's going to have to change? Just even because whether anything comes from these tariffs or not, you've got a shot across the bow here where Canada, to your point, might be a little bit more on its own and have to develop its own resources more than you thought in the past.
Yeah, no question. It's the Prime Minister Trudeau, who is still technically Prime Minister until Mark Carney gets appointed. Mark Carney's the new Liberal leader. He's not technically the Prime Minister yet. He will be within days. And if he happens to win a general election, which that's probably the next step, my guess is within the next week that we're going to see an election call in Canada. And ultimately, the Liberals, which Mark Carney leads, are going to run on a platform of, increasing pipelines and what have you, which is so different than what they did during their 9.5 years in power under Trudeau. Everything was anti-oil. We got to do an energy transition, to green energy. There's tons and tons of tax measures put in to try and incentivize and give credits for this. It's just nutty, right? And now all of a sudden they're moving back to the center, and under this, the conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, extremely popular in Canada generally, has always said that, hey, we need to break down those barriers and make sure that he hasn't used the Trump language of drill baby drill, but there's no question that he wants increased energy output. In Alberta, where I'm from, very pro energy on the whole. Of course, you get pockets of resistance, but on the whole, and it's extremely important both for our country and for our province. And so I do see increased reliance on that and increased importance of our national energy resources.
Now, for our U.S. listeners here that might be very ignorant to what the Canadian process is in terms of electing a prime minister. So a little background, Trudeau has resigned. Carney has been voted in by the Liberal Party, which essentially the party in power just basically gets to vote the PM until the general election. Do I have that kind of right?
Whoever the leader of the governing party is automatically the prime minister.
Got it. And so how long now? So Carney obviously technically not in power yet, but how long can he be in power before elections are called?
Well, right, the way that the system works in Canada, it's a parliamentary system, and so in order to sit in the House of Commons, so we have two houses. We have the House of Commons, which pretty much holds all the power, and then we have the Senate. Now, you guys have a Senate too, but it has some power. The Senate is really powerless. It has appointed senators who can kind of slow down and block legislation, but it's very, very rare. And so the House of Commons, whatever comes out of the House of Commons is ultimately usually gospel. And so right now, the Liberals hold a minority position in the House of Commons.
Okay. So they can't stop it.
No. And so, but Parliament has been prorogued, which means that the House hasn't been sitting. And they did this in order to get a new leader, because Trudeau said he would resign once a new leader got in place. He did that on January the 6th of this year. So the House, there's been no government activity or parliamentary activity since last year. And so with all this stuff happening with tariffs and Trump and what have you, we've had no functioning, responsible parliamentary response. And so the next steps, the government is, Parliament is supposed to convene on March the 24th. But today, we're recording this on March the 11th. This is my guess. I could be wrong, but this is my guess. We'll have the appointment of Mark Carney by the Governor General, because the Governor General is the kind of functioning head of government. And it's goes back to British days, where appointed by the king or the queen. And so the Governor General is kind of the head of government, but it's truly the Prime Minister more than anything. It's more ceremonial. But technically, the Governor General has to appoint the Prime Minister. At that point, I'm sure Carney will likely call a general election before Parliament comes back on March the 24th.
Okay.
If he does that, then we have a general election within, say, 40 days, in that range. So sometime by the end of April, and then we'll see what happens. The other option is that Parliament comes back, he's appointed as Prime Minister, but he can't sit in the House because he doesn't have a seat. He's not elected. And so he would be Prime Minister that cannot sit as the functioning head of government during session, which is very strange. And so I don't think he would allow that. And there is the possibility that the minority government would fall, because the other opposition parties would gang up and say, you know what, we're done with you. And then and if that happens, then there's an election call. So it's an interesting process, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks here.
And in terms of future prospects, in terms of who will be prime minister, no offense to Canadians, but I've always viewed Justin Trudeau as being a ridiculous and silly human being, and I can't believe he's lasted for as long as he has. I've always been a massive fan of Pierre. I think this guy, following him to as much as you do down here in the United States, this guy, everything he's saying to me makes a ton of sense. We're in Canada almost every single summer, with the exception of a few years there during COVID. People up there are hurting. There's no question about that, as they are in certain areas here in the United States. Has all of the tariff stuff and has some of Trump's rhetoric, has this impacted Poilievre's ability to potentially win this? Because he was probably up by 20 points prior to all this. But are they now are Canadians that are super pissed off at Americans and Trump, are they lumping Pierre in with that group, or are they still viewing him independently? Now, to his credit, he has separated himself, and he's never really lopped himself in with Trump. But is that distinction there among Canadians?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me caveat this by saying I'm personal friends with Pierre Poilievre, and so I've gotten to know him on a personal basis for
Is he
quite
as
some
smart
time.
as I think he is?
He is as transparent and as smart as it gets. I'll give you an example, and I don't think he'd mind me sharing this. You know, ever since I've got to know him, and I got to know him because of my tax expertise, we would share things back and forth. And so, this is about a year or so ago. He calls me on a tax matter and says, "Hey, Kim, blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Well, no, it's this, this, and this." And he goes, "Yeah, but I thought what you're saying is because of that." And I said, "Jesus, you're right." I said, "Who the hell's the tax expert here, Pierre?"
Yeah.
And so, and I've known this for a long time. I've had the benefit of, a nice personal relationship with him. I've known he's a smart guy, but that was just a nice reminder that, holy cow, this guy gets it. He's a very logical brained guy, and he's as transparent as they get. So thank God he's as thick skinned as he is, because I don't think I could do some of the stuff that he does. He's very witty, thinks on his feet, and he puts up with the bullshit press very, very nicely. Whereas I don't have any patience for that kind of stuff. So that's just a little caveat.
He has the ability, just watching from afar. This is a guy that has the ability to completely make the press look like idiots, but without doing it in a childish way. I mean, he essentially he uses that brain of his like a sword and just slices them in two. It's unbelievable to watch.
Yeah, he's incredible. In terms of current events, Justin Trudeau, the reason he resigned, or one of the reasons why he resigned, and I share your sentiments, by the way. Every time the guy spoke, and even today, I can't stand listening to him. I have to turn the channel or turn something. I just dismiss the guy because, frankly, and this is going to sound like a personal attack. It's not intended to be, but he's an idiot. He's just a functioning idiot. So I guess that is a personal attack. So from that, I'll move on. But the Canadian public and even his party got to the point where, just the name Trudeau is so toxic. And so the party was anxious to turn the channel. And so the fact that they have a new leader that's not named Trudeau, there's automatically going to be a bump, because some of those liberals that left and were going to vote, conservatives, hold their nose and vote conservative, or the other left-leaning party, NDP, they've got them back now because there's now a leader that's not named Trudeau. Carney has been positioned as a bit of a savior, though, because his CV, like, he's certainly, no question, brighter from an educational perspective, and his resume is impressive with his quasi-governmental positions, being the Bank of Canada governor, the Bank of England, the UN climate envoy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are impressive CV. And so what we're seeing is very coordinated postings on LinkedIn and Twitter, where it says, here's Mark Carney's credentials, here's Pierre Poilievre's credentials. And people are supposed to be impressed by that. Now, they'll get the low IQ people that get impressed by that, but the real trigger here is, have people forgotten the last 9.5 years of under the Liberal Party? I think for the most part, most Canadians have not. And to your point about the Midwest struggles, there's a lot of Canadians that struggled during COVID, during the inflationary aftermath, and the attacks on business, the attacks on the high tax rates imposed. So there's a ton of Canadians that won't forget that. Where I think this is heading, if you want my prediction, is that prior to Mark Carney being appointed, it would be such a big anti-Trudeau backlash. There would be one of the biggest super majorities in Canadian history in favor of Pierre. Today, I think it's more of a fight. I think it's more of a campaign. Campaigns do matter. And I do think that Pierre will be successful. The question is, what will the majority be or the minority be? I personally think that it'll be a majority, because Pierre can think on his feet during a campaign. He could debate very nicely. Carney is just very inexperienced and not as bright as people think he is, especially when it comes to taxation policy, which is my area. He's a lightweight. He's much more of an ideologically bent guy on climate, which makes no sense. And so I do think Pierre will win the day, but certainly not in the supermajority territory that I kind of hope for.
Now, you are, as you mentioned, a tax expert and probably know as much as anybody about Canadian taxes. Let's assume that Pierre wins, and in your narrative is what occurs. First of all, is he going to have the power to make significant changes with the Canadian tax code? But if he did, what would you advise him to do to make Canada as competitive as possible? Because I'm a believer. I think that I believe in the expanding pie, and so I think that Canada's success and the United States' success can be equally intertwined. And I, as at least personally, I want to see a very successful Canada. I think it benefits everyone. But what can he do to make your country more competitive, where you're not getting that capital and that brain drain down to the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer to that will depend on whether or not he gets a majority or a minority. If he gets a minority, it'll be tougher to impose what he wants to do, obviously, on not just tax, but on everything. If he gets a majority, then he's got free hand to pretty much do whatever he wants. And with respect to tax, he's been pretty clear for about the last year now that within 60 days of becoming prime minister, he's going to call a tax reform task force, as he calls it, to basically get the task force to look at all the things that they can change in the tax system to put more money. He's got a mandate list of what he wants, and basically it's reduce taxes for workers, incentivize entrepreneurs. And he's got this thing, he wants to encourage, Canadians to invest in Canada as opposed to outside of Canada. And so I do think under those pillars, you're going to see some very, very significant changes. And frankly, it's long overdue. The most significant tax reform that we saw in Canada last happened in 1972. We've had pockets of change, pockets of little mini change since then, but nothing material. Or I shouldn't say material, nothing massive. Whereas in the United States, if I recall correctly, there was 1986 tax reform, big changes. And then, of course, Trump tax reform in 2017, I believe it was, or was it 18, I guess, big changes there. And we anticipate that there's version 2 coming, from Trump on tax reform as well. So I do think that tax reform is massively necessary. That's bad English, but hopefully you get what I mean. In order to, compete with the United States, at least better, and compete worldwide better. Right now, with our high personal tax rates, as an easy example, in Ontario, the province where you got into fistfights with your friends when you called them
Wrestling.
First.
Fists were never thrown, but there was some wrestling and some tackling.
The highest marginal tax rate there is 54% on income of roughly over $200,000. I mean, that's craziness, right? Yeah. And so that's an easy thing to take a look at. Obviously, it's going to be combined with massive cost-cutting stuff because we have such a bloated bureaucracy and massive overspending. It's not even funny. So, that's a short answer to a very complex question, but I do think we're going to see some massive changes should he get a majority.
Yeah, the challenge that Canada has, I think, that mirrors the United States is if there's the biggest long-term concern I have for my own country, and I would lump Canada in with this because I think you have some of the same trends, is we have 37 trillion dollars worth of debt. It's unsustainable. There's no way that we can maintain this. So you've got a couple choices. You've either got to freeze spending or slash it enough to where it's some balance and you grow your way out of it, or you monetize the whole thing. But that's my number one concern is at some point there's a fiscal cliff, and do we get to Japan levels where you're 250% of GDP? Do we have that much rope to hang ourselves with? But do you think, looking in your own country and then also across the border at the United States, do you think a combination of sane tax policy, of cutting out the bureaucracy and cutting the bloat, which we have enormously down here as well, have our countries respectively passed the point of no return where you can fiscally save us? Or is it not too late? Because I don't know the answer to that, quite frankly.
I share the same thing. I don't really know the answer, although I can tell you that I hang out with some pretty strong economists, and not the least of which is a fellow by the name of Jack Mintz. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he's one of Canada's preeminent and well-respected economists. And I've got to know him personally over the last decade or so as well. I think if you were to ask him, his answer would likely be, and I know I'm putting words in his mouth, and if he listens to this podcast, he might correct me, but I would think he would say, no, we haven't reached the point of no return, but it's going to require some very, very significant changes. That would be my guess what he says. And the reason why is because I think there's some easy things to do to try and course correct. We're roughly $2 trillion in debt. And for a country our size compared to the United States, that's a lot. That's a lot. You guys are not quite 10 times the population of ours. But so all to say, we're going to have to go through a major cost-cutting exercise as well. I'll give you the example that I've written about a lot. Our Canada Revenue Agency, which is the equivalent, kind of, to your IRS. Your IRS has different roles, but our Canada Revenue Agency administers the tax law. So an important job to do, right? Collect taxes, make sure that tax laws are administered correctly. We, at this, 5 years ago, we had 29,000 CRA employees, which for a country our size, that's a lot, right? You just do the mental math. But today, it's almost double that. It's not quite that. In the span of 5 years, we've doubled, not quite. I think it's 46% increase. That's ridiculous. Yes, our tax laws have become more complicated in the last 5 years, but nothing like that. And so that's an obvious point where you need to cut, making sure, of course, that our country can still function and collect taxes. But but that's an example of bloat to the extreme.
Now, let's say that Pierre does not win in the springtime, which I hope he does, and you hope he does as well. Do you think there's been a lot of conversation within Canada among some of the politicians, at least that we're hearing down here, particularly on the Liberal side, of this very strong alignment, say, with the EU, almost forming like a counterblock to the United States with the EU? Is that something that has any legs or could get some steam in Canada?
I think under both Pierre and Liberal-led government under Carney, I think you're going to see efforts towards that. Pierre is not a big fan of Trump. It's it. Now, do I think Pierre would be in a better spot, in a better respectful spot to negotiate with Trump? For sure. Because I think it's no secret that Trump just simply didn't respect, the radical left-leaning Trudeau. And my suspicion is that Carney will fall into that same camp.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that perspective alone, if Carney was in power, I think you're going to see an aggressive increase in alliances to Europe and others would be my guess. Here, my suspicion would be that just for the sake of the country, you'd want to do that in any event.
Right.
But there would certainly be a much more friendly negotiating stance as opposed to such a polarizing stance. I mean, here's a quick example, which I presume you heard about. But when Trump won the election, what was it? Within 10 days, I think, we have Trudeau pontificating about how the American people basically didn't have the balls to vote for a women president.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And it was much more offensive in terms of the actual quote than I said. But I mean, who does that? Like, which leader of Canada does that? I mean, that's just poking the bear. And so do I think that some of the fallout that we've seen is rather personal from Trump? Sure. Why wouldn't it be? With an emotional guy like Trump, and so I don't think you'd see stuff like that as much if it was Pierre in power. That would be my guess, at least anyhow.
Kind of a final question for you here. So you're friends with Pierre. You've got his ear. What would your advice be to him about negotiating with Trump? How he handles Trump? How he handles this tariff issue?
Well, I think my advice would be, I mean, he's a much better politician than Pierre is than I ever will be, because politics doesn't interest me as a career choice. I'd much rather be a tax guy. But the approach that Pierre has taken is I think a pretty good one, and I'd encourage him to continue to do that, which is, listen, we need to protect our sovereign interests. We're not going to back down to encroachment on our sovereignty, and it's going to be, as the phrase he uses, is Canada first. And I think that's a good rallying cry, but it needs to be taken a lot further than that. Canada first means reform tax, better economic policies. If Trump wants a revised trade agreement, let's go negotiate one, and hopefully we again protect our sovereignty. I think those pillars are pretty important, and frankly, I don't think he needs my advice because he's on the right track with that in any event.
Do you think the damage done here between our two countries in the last couple of months how long is this going to take to fix? I believe it's going to be fixable. I think that we're like siblings that are kind of battling it out a little bit. But how long is it going to take for the ill will up there to fade away?
I think it's going to take more than a month or 2 or 6. I think it'll probably take a change of government with more friendly overtones, and a government that's willing to, like, one of the phrases that the government right now is proposing, I already mentioned this, is Team Canada, and they're promoting this elbows up approach. How about F you? That is such ridiculous virtue signaling, but that's gonna, if you keep that kind of elbows up message and mantra up there, that inflames our American friends, in my view, and it'll take much longer to heal. I think a much more conciliatory approach in terms of, hey, listen, we don't need to be confrontational here. What's going on? What do you guys want? And, oh, you want that? Well, probably not, but let's talk about that. And that, to me, if you have that kind of approach, then the reconciliation will be rather short. My
Yeah,
guess would be.
I've never gotten that. Just as an aside, I recall after the Iraq War started down here, and I think France denied us some overfly rights or something like that, and we couldn't have French fries anymore. They were serving freedom fries in the
I
capital.
remember that. Yeah.
And it's just like, you guys are freaking idiots, man. Like, just
Yeah.
speak to the Canadian people or speak to the American people like adults, and stop with the propaganda bullshit, and let's just, cut the brass tacks and get it done. So, anyway, Kim,
Yeah, I
this was
agree.
awesome, man. I really appreciate this. Your expertise, obviously, in what's going on there in Canada and also here in the United States is extremely deep. I know that you are an incredibly busy guy, and it means a lot to me. Personally, you took time out of your day to have this conversation with me.
Well, my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to chat with friends of Bill, and happy to do so.
And last question, people curious about your work and what you do, how do they find you?
If you Google my name, Kim GC Moody, you'll find me. I've got a couple platforms online. One is my firm, Moody's Tax, Moody's Private Client. I stepped down from the leadership of that firm about a year and a half ago, but I'm still with the firm, and but I also do a lot of things on my own. I have my own personal website at kimgcmoody.com and do a lot of public speaking, a lot of writing, and so yeah, find me there, and on LinkedIn, of course. I'm a bit of a loudmouth and opinionated fellow on LinkedIn.
That mentions somebody else I know that we're going to get to in just a second. But before we go to him, Kim, I'm curious about the role the media plays in all of this. And I'm going to ask this question as a media guy, as a former business and financial media guy at that. There aren't a lot of people who are writing in the financial press who understand economics and tax in the United States. They're not there. And I know because I used to have to argue with kids when I hired them, and I would have fights with them. So I'm curious in terms of where the press stands in Canada, if they understand not who they, not in the sense of who they're going to endorse, but do they understand the economic circumstances that Canada finds itself in right now, and are they prepared to cover this in a fair way, or are they just so tilted toward the left side of the table they can't help themselves?
I think there's pockets of Canadian media that are, rather informed. Better informed is probably a
Mhm.
better phrase, than certainly the vast majority of Canadian media. The vast majority of Canadian media, Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, CTV, Bell Media, etc., CBC especially, which that can't go away soon enough, is so left leaning and
Yeah.
biased. And I know you have very similar things in the States
Oh,
with
yeah.
NBC and CBS and ABC and blah, 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 and especially CNN. But in Canada, it's perpetuated by government funding of these media through journalism tax credits. If you employ a journalism person in your newsroom, in a newsprint organization, you can get up to roughly $40,000 per head funded. That stuff just breeds bias. And ever since they introduced those rules in 2019, off the top of my head, we've just seen
Mm.
even more of a decline than there ever was. So,
Yeah.
so the short answer is finding those pockets that get it is tough.
Well, in the States, we were fortunate enough to have, I'm going to use the word revolution, and I bet it's a bit hyperbolic, but we had a real change in the way the media addressed people. We had media outlets rise up, and there are now a myriad of reliable, good, what were once called alternative media now being widely read. Do you have that kind of phenomenon in Canada, or are you, because of the state sponsorship, really locked into that?
Yeah, there's pockets. Like there's a organization called The Hub, which is quite good actually. But unfortunately, a lot of the other alternative sources are very either radically left, which are
Mm.
most of them, or are considered to be, I love this, far right. And so they get put into a box, and And like, for example, Mark Carney last week when he was doing his rallies, his political rallies, he had a list that he would allow in. And anybody that was alternative media that was viewed to be not sympathetic was out. And he had the RCMP make sure that they wouldn't enter the room. I mean, it's nutty stuff, and unfortunately, we're not seeing, at least from my perspective, we're not seeing that kind of alternative media flourish yet. But I do think it will happen if we see the CBC go away, which is one of Pierre's promises. He's going to defund them, which can happen soon enough. And then two, if we see a lot of these journalism credits go away, we'll see some of the radical newspapers die, which they should die. And I think eventually we're going to see organizations like CTV just disappear, which is great. Global news, can't wait. See ya.
CBC, for those who are listening who aren't familiar with it, is Canadian Broadcasting Company. So, Brent, I'm sorry I jumped in on that, and I got a little involved. Thank you. That was a entertaining and fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed listening to it. Brent, for people who are listening to the podcast who are thinking that you are the kind of person they might want to have some contact with or reach out to, how do they do that?
Here's a guy that can talk a little bit about Canada anyway. Pretty active on LinkedIn as well, and I'm usually I've said this every time we complete these podcasts, but people do DM me on LinkedIn. It is me on the other side responding to that. Website is tws.finance, and there's pretty much every conceivable way to reach me on the website.
That's great. And as a guy connected to Brent on LinkedIn, I can vouch for the fact that is him. And those are his opinions and his ideas that he's expressing and which you can engage with him on. The other thing you can do if you're listening to this podcast and aren't a subscriber already is just become a subscriber. Hit the follow button. That way you're notified every time a new episode is dropped and you can listen to it. The other thing I would ask is if you like it, share it. Let people know about it. Rate it. Give it a good rating, because word of mouth promotion is invaluable in this world of bots and all kinds of other crazy things that go on out there. It is great to hear from somebody saying, I like this podcast. You should probably give it a listen. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of Brent and everybody at TWS. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Smart Money Simplified. Have questions about topics covered during the show? Visit our website at www.smartmoneysimplified.com or give us a call at 602-255-0555. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of the wealth stewards or concurrent investment advisors. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.